I have a PowerPoint just highlighting some of the main contributions in my book and giving an overview of the book. So I thought I might share that with you. Is that coming through on the screen, I hope? Yeah. All right. So, my book tells the long bipartisan history of the expulsion of non-citizens, and in some cases, citizens and permanent residents from the United States, starting in the late 19th century and going up, as Paul mentioned, to the present, or at least till 2019, when I needed to submit my full manuscript to the publisher. There are 5 things that I'd like to highlight today, and you can see here the table of contents, which gives you, a broad overview of what I cover in the book. But the first is that long bipartisan history. I think many people today are thinking about deportation, thinking about immigration policy and its punitive impact on communities in the United States. But as we all know as historians, this story dates back much earlier, and not just to the Obama years when my project started. It was part inspired, I think, by the targeting of non-citizens during the previous administration and the ways that young people are coming out and as undocumented and unafraid and mobilizing, putting their bodies on the line in many cases in acts of civil disobedience, to push against punitive policies and to push for more humane reforms. So my project, on the one hand, is trying to understand and explain how the immigration bureaucracy has changed during the last century and a half, roughly, kind of the political institutional history. And at the same time, understand, as Veronica does as well, the impact these policies have had on migrants and migrant communities, and the ways that people have pushed back and fought back against such policies, and on behalf of themselves, and in many cases, I think, redefine belonging in ways that transcend formal legal citizenship. And I think that's certainly a commonality between our 2 books. So one thing is certainly the long bipartisan history that I traced during the last 140 years, starting with the targeting of Chinese migrants in the late 19th century, Southern and Eastern Europeans, and then really focusing on Mexican migrants throughout the 20th century, and more recently, Central Americans during the last decade especially, but even in the late 20th century as well. The second thing that I want to just highlight and emphasize for people is, that deportation without due process, something we've heard about in the news very frequently in recent weeks as the Trump administration has tried to ramp up expedited removals. This is more or less the American way, is what my research has shown. And I traced 3 different mechanisms of expulsion, which you can see here at the top of the screen here. Formal deportations, voluntary departures, and self-deportations. And these are the 3 mechanisms of the machine that I trace during the course of the last century plus. And what I found is that they've always worked in collaboration with one another, some coming to the fore at certain moments, but immigration officials, local and state officials, and even ordinary citizens have weaponized and used these expulsion mechanisms to try to push, force, or coerce people out of the country. There have been 57 million deportations during the last 140 years. That was a number that shocked me when I first came across it, probably in 2009. It was slightly smaller then, but I first came across that while writing a piece for Dissent magazine that looked at the history of voluntary departures in particular and raised some of the broader questions the book addresses, like what kind of nation is the United States? But what I realized, and as you can see here in the chart, is that we really can't understand the history of deportation without taking these coercive mechanisms seriously. We need to really focus on them, in fact, because they represent 85 to 90% of the deportations, since the late 19th century, when the federal government took control over immigration. So I started out really focusing on voluntary departures and the role that they played. And I'd be happy to describe these in more depth during the Q&A perhaps. But these have been expedited unilateral expulsions at the hands of low-level officials. I think in recent months, we've seen with the uprisings across the country, the Black Lives Matter movement, why it might be problematic to instill low-level officers of the state with extraordinary power. And the same goes for immigration. And most people never have their day in court, so to speak. There is no judge in black robes presiding over a trial or a hearing and weighing the merits of a case. Most times people have had very little ability, to fight for the right to stay in the country. And these voluntary departures, just so it's clear, these happen after apprehension, after someone is apprehended, and then officials coerce or pressure them to agree to leave the country and not fight their case, right? There's nothing voluntary about them. The self-deportations, and just very briefly, are when immigration policies or fear campaigns, oftentimes using the media to spread the fear, sometimes violence or the threat of violence, have been used to make people's lives so miserable or so difficult that they pick up and leave without ever having come into contact with an immigration official. So these are the three mechanisms I trace, and I'm really focusing on the second and the third. Although one of the real surprising discoveries I made was that the formal deportations, which you see that uptick after 1996, which a lot of social scientists, legal scholars, journalists have focused on, those have come to resemble voluntary departures in many ways. Those are now streamlined. They oftentimes do not happen by order of a judge. They are streamlined, and there's very little due process, if any, involved in those expulsions. So they've come to resemble voluntary departures in the streamlined nature. The next thing is that I found there's been a disproportionate targeting of Mexicans. Perhaps not surprising to many of us, but it's even more than I would have imagined. As a scholar of Latinx history and migration history, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me that Mexicans have been the primary target of the machine, but we're talking to the tune of 85 again, or 90% of all expulsions throughout US history have been of Mexicans. And most has been through voluntary departure. And I think there's a real cost here. And this is where I'm in dialogue some with social scientists like Doug Massey, Jorge Durand, and others that have described the system that developed after 1965 that worked for employers and worked for the Immigration Service because they kept a circular flow of exploitable labor. But what we haven't really taken into consideration are the ways that multiple apprehensions and living in fear of apprehension might affect people's lives. So I really emphasize the fact that in the voluntary departure system, or the revolving door system, as some people have referred to it, exacted a punitive cost. And I think that's something that we need to fully reckon with. And it's also something that has not only affected individuals and families and communities, but gone a long way to creating broader stereotypes, harmful, inaccurate stereotypes of Mexicans as prototypical illegal aliens. And this photograph you see here, this is from the 1980s, after a young boy, 14 years old, who was a legal resident, was apprehended and deported, which just speaks to the fact that ethnic Mexicans, including legal permanent residents and citizens, oftentimes, found themselves trapped up in the machine as well. The fourth thing that I wanted to mention briefly are the human costs involved. As Veronica stresses throughout her book, and I am also very interested in understanding how these federal bureaucracies have shaped people's lives. And I think in the case of deportation, I discovered that oftentimes there's a really toxic combination of profits and punishment that shape policy and its implementation. I traced the transportation networks that existed in the middle of the 20th century, starting in the 20s, going through the 70s. As we know, they still exist today. And I show the ways that private companies, not just US companies, but private companies, including Mexican companies like the owners of this ship here that you see down into the below deck or the hold, transported tens of thousands of Mexican migrants in the middle of the 20th century across the Gulf of Mexico from Port Isabel, Texas, in the lower Rio Grande Valley to Veracruz. And we might think of these as an early example of prevention through deterrence, which we know more recently about the separation of Central American asylum-seeking families. And this is certainly an earlier instantiation where the policies were meant to turn a profit for the companies. They're also meant to punish migrants in hopes of discouraging them from ever returning to the United States. We know that these did not succeed in stopping migration, but we also know that they exacted an extraordinary physical, psychological, and material cost. And the final thing that I wanted to mention is the fact that as long as the machine has been around, people have been organizing and fighting against it. And the machine has been vulnerable, and trying to break down and understand the machine and how it works, I think, is the first step to figuring out what its weak points are, perhaps, and how you might apply pressure to them, and then, hopefully reform it, dismantle it, overhaul it entirely. But I trace the long history of people organizing and fighting back against the machine, as shown here in this picture from the late 1970s. And I zoom in and focus on a story of a group of shoe factory workers in suburban LA that organized and successfully figured out ways to bring the machine to a halt. and win important rights for migrants. And the real takeaway there was, this was based on broad-based organizing, sustained struggle, and solidarity. So these are the 5 points that I wanted to share with you all today. And I know that I am running out of time, so I'll leave it at that. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.